It's 2024. There's thousands of architecture students in the world, and everyone wants to get a job at their dream firm. You begin to wonder, how will I get it if I don't stand out? How do I make myself a better designer?
Look, we've all been there. There's this itch of wanting to be better and to learn more, but you don't exactly know where to start. University and studio are very, very important, but there's only so much you can learn from your classes alone. You can't do the bare minimum anymore.
Architecture school will teach you how to be an average designer, but if you want to be astounding, you got to put in the extra work. So stick with us to the end of the episode because we've got your back, and we're giving you all the info you need to set yourself apart from all the other architecture students.
So grab a book, pull up Google, and let's get into it.
In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to the Crit Room Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan, with my co-host,
Albert, just Albert.
How's it going, Albert?
Doing good. I was wondering if you did your homework, Ryan, with the One Piece action. Did you watch episode 2?
Okay, listen. I got the first episode in. I watched it with Sully. I was about to watch the second episode. It was already like 1 a.m. We had to record this thing, and I'm not gonna lie, I probably fell asleep on the couch right after we stopped the recording. But
how'd you like episode 1 of One Piece?
It's pretty good. Again, I'm somewhat familiar with One Piece. I remember watching the animation when it was back on Cartoon Network or whatever, maybe 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. I saw the live action commercials on Netflix and everything, and I thought it was pretty interesting. And the first episode, at least from what I could tell, it did a good job at setting it up. I was wanting to watch the next episode. Again, it's just time, man. Time.
No, for real. No, I remember because I watched One Piece in the beginning, so without the live action in the beginning. I remember when I first watched the live action, I was against the idea from the very beginning. I was like, this is gonna look goofy as hell. This is gonna look I just was not about it. And then I was watching it, and as I got into more later to the episodes, episode 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, specifically from 5, 6, 7, 8, it just got so much better every single time. So yeah,
I'm excited. I think it really will be a great show, and I'm excited to watch the next episode. I will do it. I will do my homework assignment. But
yes, sir.
But anyways, all that aside, we're actually really glad to have you guys listening to us today because this topic is something we really deeply care about, and it's something that I think we all need to listen to and take a lot more seriously, especially if you want to start taking control of your own education. And listen, we're on your guys' side. We want you to be at the top of your studio. We want you to be that person that's selected in your studio and the winner of your competition and everything. We want you to be that person that people ask to see your portfolio. How cool would that be? And we want you to be that person that lands your dream job. But why do we care? Why do we want you to be at the top? Honestly, again, it just comes down to our mission. We're all about helping you conquer the challenges of the studio and architecture school. And honestly, this is one of the biggest ones of making yourself stand out.
So let's start this out, Ryan.
Okay. Neglecting your ability to self-teach in architecture won't just limit your growth. It could be the very thing that prevents you from getting that dream job.
School isn't enough. And if you haven't seen our first episode about the 5 things we learned from our 5 years in architecture, you should go check that out because we talk about some very, very controversial stuff from there. But it talks about how school doesn't go in depth in those specific topics, and they tell you to use Photoshop and other softwares, but don't really teach you how to use it, if that makes sense. They tell you to use Rhino, but then that's the limit of what they're gonna teach. They're gonna teach
they kind of
you.
just leave you hanging there.
Yeah, and then I remember some studios who had really good professors who would teach them the technology. They would be able to learn it, but some studios who had professors that were 70 plus years old, they didn't have much mentorship from the professors from them. But yeah,
that's also going back to the whole school isn't enough. That's also why internships exist. And we talked about this in other episodes too. But truly, if you want to know what's going on outside of the realm of studio, because studio is it's just a bubble, everything that happens in studio it's a little bit detached from the real world, which is why internships are so important, because it teaches you that practical sense and how architecture works in the real world, not just in a design studio. So there's just so much more out there that you need to learn that school itself won't be able to do. That's why you have to be able to want to learn more from just your studio environment. Like, you have to learn outside of things and just go beyond studio.
And I think this also goes going back to the first point of school isn't enough. This is why when you go to YouTube and you search out, like, there's 1,000 architecture content out there. So if you want to learn how to make site plans, how to do renders, how to do sections, anything, you name it, YouTube's probably got it. Like, you just search it and then it'll be there, because school isn't enough and people want to learn how to get better, and that's why they make these videos to help them out.
Architecture can't take over your whole life. You know, you need to be exposed to more things. You can't just stay in studio and just keep pounding away at architecture and just learning all of the stuff for your projects. You need to take a step back. You need to be able to relate to things that are completely unrelated to architecture and think a little bit outside the box. I don't know if you guys have ever watched this show called MasterChef, but it's kind of funny. I was talking to one of my coworkers about this, but it's a little funny how you watch this show and they actually talk about their dishes almost like a whole architecture presentation to be. Like, you might be inspired by watching that show of how they present their dishes. So then when you're presenting your studio project, you're the one cooking this time. And then the jury's all eating it up and everything, you know? But like, the point, again, you can find so much inspiration from how other people do things, and you can learn from that by stepping out of studio for a moment, just watching how other things work and coming back with that new refresh source of inspiration. And you can better put that into your studio process, or just learn from a lot more things, you know?
Yeah, when you start to take in a lot of these different, like, disciplines, different things that are outside of architecture, you then are becoming more resourceful because you have more of that things tucked away in the storage that you can pull out and become much better problem solvers, and so that you are more efficient with your time and everything like that.
So then this part is also, okay, I think this is also really, really important to talk about. And again, this might be a little controversial, but it's no longer enough just to be an architecture student. And what do I mean by that? Okay, or let's paint a picture. Put yourself in the shoes of an employer for just a second. What is that kind of person that you would want to hire? Like, take a second, think about it. Because I think, from my perspective, employers tend to seek out these people who are like very self-reliant in their own learning and are able to acquire new skills pretty quickly. You think about how much happens in an internship or even at your first actual job. There's so much you have to pick up. Again, studio doesn't teach you everything. So when you get to the real world, you're learning all this stuff from scratch all over again.
Yeah.
And you know, you have to be able to quickly learn things, pick a lot of things up that you weren't ever exposed to before. For example, I never knew SketchUp. I was thrown into the fire and I had to figure that thing out in like a week. Yeah. So then it's just this ability to always be on your toes, if you will. Like, you just have to be able to absorb things pretty quickly and be able to apply what you just learned as fast as possible, because now you're being paid to do it. You're no longer just sitting around in the studio just pretending that you're putting together a building or whatever. Yeah. You got to actually figure out what you're doing, because people are paying you to do what you're supposed to do. Dude. So it puts a little bit of extra pressure on things. But the other part of that too is like, what kind of person do you want to be? I think nowadays, especially, because everyone has a bachelor's degree in architecture, it seems. And like, even a master's degree, which was thought to be like, you know, that next level above, and like, oh, that would definitely help you stand out. It really doesn't anymore. Like, there's so many programs to offer these expressed 5, even 4 years sometimes, I think, master's degrees, when it used to take 6, 7, 8 years to do. So even master's degrees are a lot more accessible now than they used to be, which is a good thing. But if you are trying to stand out, that's no longer a thing that's going to help you. So from my personal opinion, this is what I started to put together in my own head, is you have to be an architecture student plus blank. What is going to be your branding as a student? Are you going to be this plus this? For example, are you going to be an architecture student plus photographer? Are you going to be an architecture student and a chef? Are you going to be an architecture student and a plant mom or a plant dad? You know, like, obviously be a bit more creative, and like, ideally you want to pick things that are a bit more applicable to the real world, or like something that a firm would want to have at their own firm. Again, thinking as an employer, what are some things that you want to see architecture grad plus blank that would make them want to hire you? So the whole thing is just like what you learn on your own time shows a sense of authenticity and shows them like how you are unique. But like
Mm-hmm.
having passions outside of architecture shows that you have a broader skill set and just shows not only that you know Revit, but you also know how to like carry on a conversation with somebody at the lunch table about One Piece or whatever it is. But again, just to drive that point home, it's just you really need to start to learn how to make yourself stand out because again
Mm-hmm.
it's no longer enough just to be an architecture grad or an architecture student. You have to do something more.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Yeah, and another thing is that technology is evolving rapidly, and we need to constantly learn so that we stay relevant within our own professions.
No, seriously.
Dude, I remember you talking about this, Ryan, but AutoCAD essentially replaced hand drafting, right? And then from
Right.
there, Revit replaced AutoCAD, and who knows what's going to come next to replace Revit. I
Well,
remember you
yeah,
said
because
something
like,
about AI, right?
well, okay, I was gonna say because with that whole thing too, it's like when AutoCAD came out, it revolutionized the whole architecture industry. No longer did you have to have an entire room full of draftsmen. You could just have maybe half, maybe a quarter of that. I don't know what the percentage is, but it would drastically reduce the amount of people you needed to draw out the designs for the building. And then AutoCAD just simplified that. And then AutoCAD became simplified again from Revit. And now all the people you used to have Rev or for AutoCAD drafting out things on the computer now you can
Yeah.
3D model the building and
Yeah,
everything.
then you
So
can
like
just get the drawing instantly right after.
it's just constantly like changing, which is kind of funny. Architecture industry as a whole, it's extremely fast to adapt new things, but it's very slow to change how things work, which is why it's
Mm.
kind of surprising because weren't you talking a little bit earlier about how like even K-State now they're starting to implement something with AI, or what was that?
Yeah, they have a class for apparently that's what I heard. They have a class for AI integration into their workflow, and
Really?
dude, it's weird because I remember back. Okay, so I remember back in school, I did try to use AI. Full disclosure, I tried to use AI, but it was only for assets, right? Like I would be like,
Hmm.
I need like a watercolor sky, um, and then I would just put it in Midjourney, and then I would download that, put it as a background, and then like that was it. But apparently, there's so much more that you can do outside of this thing. I don't know what it is, but we need to get these people on the podcast, Ryan.
Yeah, I was gonna say we really want to do an episode on AI. We're having some discussions behind the scenes about how to start building a series with it. So
Mm-hmm.
stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, it's just takeaway lesson from this point, right? It's just
Mm-hmm.
architecture as an industry is always, 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 always adapting. There's going to be new things almost every single decade, it seems. So, again, to stay on top of everything, to make yourself stand out, you have to be able to learn these new things as they're coming out all the time. Even like Albert and I, now that they've graduated, this AI thing never used to be a thing for us really until our
Mm-hmm.
5th year when we just graduated.
Mm-hmm.
So it's only a matter of time before that starts to make its way into the professional world. And we got to start to learn before other guys, like you guys in studio right now, start to be like, oh, yeah, we know AI better than these old dinosaurs that just started.
Dude,
So
Ryan
we
and I have been
also got to
using
stay on top of
ChatGPT as
things.
well, though. Like, dude,
Facts.
I think we're pretty good at ChatGPT. We sound like very boomers right now.
For real.
But yeah, no, we're also trying to integrate it into our own workflow. But as you can see, we don't really have the professors or any resources like that, so we have to learn it our own way. So we have to self teach.
Let's move on to the next thing. So, as we mentioned in the beginning, architecture school will teach you how to be an average designer. But if you want to be astounding, you have to put in the extra work. And what do we really mean by that? I guess we can talk or first start off with talking more about like experimenting with render styles and other ways to graphically experiment to make yourself become a little bit more
Hmm.
outstanding or whatever.
Yeah, I think it's really about authenticity, who you are as a person, what you want to show to people, and so first and foremost is that you want to show people that you are who you say you are, and how do you say that in architecture and in design is through render styles, the way you draw stuff, the way you do these graphic
Hmm.
designs, and essentially once you keep doing it over and over, see who you are and try to figure out who you are, the more your own style gets to be shown from. I think
Yeah.
mine started developing in my third year with the watercolor slash like some what's it called? What is it called when you
Like
like
a collage or something
yeah,
almost, you know?
collage. Yeah. Very collagey. I know Sam, I think back in second year was I think second year when he started going on the computer.
He started to
Like
pop off with his
yeah.
stuff, like very
He
dramatic
was
looking in a
yeah,
good way.
very dramatic, very like black and white. The light is just so dramatic. Everything is right there. And then with Yvette, she was really good at hand drawing already. But when she came back from that Italy trip, she went crazy. Every single thing that she did for her thesis, my God, that thing was amazing. Sully was also the same way with his
He
watercolor.
was really good at sketching with the tablet. Like we came back in the studio, well, their studio. I was adopted into their studio basically part time. They came up with this thing called the Sticky iPad Kids gang. So everyone in the studio, like overnight, all of a sudden had an iPad. And then
Yeah,
I think
I had a
Sully, between
Wacom.
Sully and Abby, they seemed, yeah, or all three of you guys, you seem to be the first adapters of like this digital art style of putting your concept diagrams instead of having to go through the process of sketching it on trace, scanning it, uploading or whatever. You could just
Hmm.
draw it and send yourself the JPEG of how you drew it on the iPad. So
Hmm.
that part was kind of cool. I think
Yeah, I think Abby did it first, and then I was like, dude, I'm not taking work back home. I'm not taking work back home. So I just got a Wacom that could just plug it into the computer and do work from there. And then Sully, oh, also Josh started doing it too, and then Amanda started asking, which one should
mm,
I do? And I was like,
it's inevitable.
technology is evolving.
Yeah, and even
Another
like
thing,
on the post editing side or the what do you call that? The post graphics. Like
yeah.
once you render it out, like how much effort you put into Photoshop. I think that's kind of where I put a lot of my effort into. Like
Hmm.
obviously setting it up in the render nice, but
Hmm.
then bringing it into Photoshop and trying to experiment out with like Camera Raw filter. If you guys know about that, game changer.
Hmm.
Try it out. It works really well.
For
Even if you just
Photoshop.
start out with like hitting the auto feature on the Camera Raw filter thing,
Mm.
really nice.
Really, dude, I remember Duck used to teach me that stuff while we were working together. He sat next to me. He was just like, "Why don't you just do this?" I'm like, "Dude, you are a genius right now." But essentially, like we had to learn a lot of like software because we didn't get taught these things, and
That's a
so
good point. Yeah, like all this experimenting, like we had that's part of the self-teaching aspect that we were talking about.
mhm,
Like Edward was just saying, like we had to go out of our way to start learning these things on our own time, which I don't think
mhm,
is a bad thing, but it's just the reality of it, you know? Like
mhm.
your professor is not going to sit down with you at your desk and tell you, "All right, so what kind of render style are you looking to learn today?"
It's really hard to teach that because, like I said, it's really about who you are as a person. So you need to figure that out first and foremost.
Yeah. And I guess on that point too about the whole your professor is not going to just sit down with you and help you figure it out. I mean, to a certain degree. But when you're talking about like learning Rhino, learning Revit, learning SketchUp, whatever for the first time, I mean, our school did a pretty good job at teaching us like the very basics. They had this digital architecture class, and they would walk us through a tutorial almost of like, here's how we get from point A to the final part of the
Hmm.
project for your homework assignment or whatever. And
Hmm.
then for the most part, it was simple to follow along with those things. But then it's one of those parts where you realize once the tutorial is done, now you got to figure out how to do everything else from there. Like they teach you how
Hmm.
to use the certain tools, but you're ultimately the one holding the tools and you have to build yourself a house, metaphorically, you know? It's like,
Mm. Dude,
so
that's the
you got
genius
to
way to put
learn
it.
on your own how to do all these crazy, like they taught you how to do 90-degree angles, but how are you going to build a frame of the house that's not 90 degrees? What if it's 130? What if it's whatever? Who are you going to talk to learn those things? And that's usually
Yeah.
where YouTube tends to come in. And like
Hmm.
for specific answers that you need, sometimes your professors can fill in those gaps when you're asking them in one-on-one.
Hmm.
But ultimately, I think you just have to go and find like tutorials on YouTube and stuff for a lot of these
Hmm.
things, which like Aber was saying at the beginning, that's why there's like thousands of architecture content out there, you know, like
Hmm.
there's so many like very precise questions that people ask that you want precise answers to. And it's really
Hmm.
hard to get that even on tutorials and stuff.
Yeah.
So
Wait, Ryan, you said something about your grasshopper and brick screen thing, right? I remember in fourth year you did something with mapping or something. I don't know what it was, but like mapping a brick
oh
screen on your
yeah.
grasshopper.
Yeah, that's okay. Actually, that does bring me up to another thing. Similar to how, like, or let me put it this way. I think when you're in studio, oftentimes you're very pressed for time and you don't get a chance to always experiment with other things.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes it kind of frustrating when you're trying to learn how to do specific things. Like, for
Mm-hmm.
example, in Rhino or whatever, there's many programs that can plug into Rhino, such as Grasshopper, or there's a few other ones out there too, but Grasshopper is kind of the main one. But the idea is sometimes when you're going outside of your normal boundaries and you're trying to learn like a new skill,
Mm-hmm.
things like Grasshopper can really come in handy because it's really daunting. I'm not going to lie. I hate programming. It's the most complicated thing for my brain to pick up. So when people were talking to me about my project, I was trying to come up with this brick screen for one of my farmers market projects. And obviously you could go about it manually and like create these bricks, stack them up and radiate them around a line or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But that would have taken ages. Like that would, I don't know how long that would have taken,
Yeah.
but I knew enough to know it was not going to be possible to do it by hand, especially if I had messed up on something and had to redo that entire wall or something.
Dude, that would suck.
So that's when I knew at that moment I had to find some other way to do this thing. And that's when I've heard from someone else in my studio, oh, you should learn Grasshopper. I'm like, oh, not that.
No, this was actually in third year, right? Like you did the farmers market. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I remember now. Right.
There's some kind of point that I'm trying to make with this. And it's essentially, you know, I don't know. Maybe you can help out, Hopper.
Well, I think,
what am I trying to say?
Well, for reference, your brick screen, well, typically brick screens or the brick itself was like stacked on into each other and like pressed onto each other. But what you were trying to do was separate those brick screens so that you can have more ventilation, more things that come in, and more like perforation between this side and that side. And so the hardest part of that was, am I going to build this one by one as a model? And if you do that and the professor says this isn't good enough, you're going to have to change it. And so you're going to have to copy paste every single one of them.
Yeah.
That was like the biggest question. So you were like, frick, I'm going to find a tutorial with Grasshopper, and then that will teach me how to do the brick screens, bake it. And if it doesn't work with the professor, okay, delete that, bake another one.
It would be so much easier that way. I think that's a better way to summarize it. It was just the time I knew that going into it could be relatively simple to just create it, but learning how to use that skill with Grasshopper, adding that to my toolbox would just help later on. So like Abra was saying, when I had to make those changes, I didn't have to redraw the whole screen. I could just slide a slider and make it smaller, make it bigger, whatever. And like that's 5 seconds. The tutorial might be took like 15, 20, 30 minutes or something. But now I have that and I know how to use these things.
Yeah.
So
now he has that in his toolbox. But another thing that our school didn't really teach us was that storytelling and the crafting the story part. I remember in our third, all throughout our classes, it was kind of like something that was said is like, you need to learn how to present a project before you come to architecture school or during architecture school. And it wasn't until our third year with Professor Hitz Different that specifically she was very adamant on taking away the the sort ofs, the kind ofs into our vocabulary when presenting, because that took away from the message itself. I remember during the lecture halls with specific professors, I would get so turned off by the presentations because they just kept saying sort of, kind of, because it was drilled into my brain by the professor what hits different. And it was so frustrating.
Oh, and I mean, we're not perfect. We're still stumbling here and there in our podcast episodes and everything, but we are trying to get better. We are trying to get better. So Professor Hitz Different, if you ever see this, we're trying.
Yeah. And there's also some professors and maybe some jurors that are more willing to give pointers when you present. I don't know if you have experiences with that, Ryan, but me personally, I remember first year, I was so nervous. The juror was just like, take a second, breathe. This isn't life or death. Just present. And then I peed my pants, but yeah.
No, I mean, that's a pretty fair point. I think I was told something pretty similar to that. I still fumble a lot with this, but just slowing down when you're talking about things can really help keep your mind clear. A lot of the times when people use those filler words like kind of whatever's, it's usually because they're moving to, or they're talking too fast for their brain to process what they're trying to say. So
Mm-hmm.
when your mouth is speaking faster than your brain can process, it lags for a bit, and that's when you say like the
Kind
thing
of.
like kind
Mm-hmm.
of.
Mm-hmm.
If you notice yourself doing that, that's
Mm-hmm.
probably what's happening. So that really good tip is just trying to slow down.
Yeah.
Again, when you get more precise with your speech, when you get more concise with the words that you're going to use, which is why it's important to practice your presentation. So when you're in
Mm-hmm.
front of the jurors, you're talking about your project, you have a very good understanding of what you're talking about in your projects, and you can say it in a more concise way.
Mm-hmm.
So you limit the amount of time you need to talk about it.
Right. And so, in the end, the lesson is that basically we were never taught how to present. And so we had to find our own way to present and find other resources that we could have found outside of architecture, or we couldn't find in architecture. And so we went outside of architecture to find those resources ourselves so that we can teach ourselves how to present the project itself. Because,
Yeah, I remember watching a lot of Bjarke Ingels TED Talks. The
mm-hmm.
way, because I remember specifically in Professor Hitt's different class, for whatever reason, she just inspired me a lot more to present things in a way than other professors did. So I was really captivated in learning how do I present this thing
Yeah.
to people that makes them just as excited about this as I am. And then for whatever reason, I think I was just recommended the videos on the sidebar of YouTube or whatever. And I saw Bjarke Ingels doing a TED Talk. I'm like, this is one of the industry leaders, how does he talk about his projects? And I mean, say what you want about his projects or whatever, but I think he's really, really good at just telling a story and making
Mm-hmm.
people invested and walking people through a process in such a great way where you follow him every single step and you are sold on this idea that
Mm-hmm.
what he chose to do is the ultimate right decision in the project or whatever.
Right. I
Like,
think that's what got him so like popular was because he knew how to tell a story. He knew how to tell his sell his product. And dude, that man's is making bajillion dollars right now, I think.
yeah, but it's again going back to the idea of looking at other resources outside of studio. It took looking at those TED Talks.
Mm-hmm.
It took interviews from other architects,
Right.
hearing how they talk about things
Mm-hmm.
to then influence how we would talk about things in our projects.
Right.
So I think that's a pretty good way to wrap that part up.
Right. And I think it also ties into our next point, which is something that I was really interested in with TED Talks and stuff like that. If you're someone who's always been interested in everything and not really been able to tie yourself down to a single thing, you can probably relate to this point. Essentially, I was interested in a lot of things, and I was always wondering how I could intersect a lot of these different ideas, different like disciplines into what I love, which is architecture and the field of architecture. So if you follow my logic here for a second, because it could get confusing, but in my head, architecture is an art form, right? Do you agree, Ryan?
Yeah.
So
No, I think so.
yeah,
To a
so I
certain
was
degree.
trying to look at other art forms from other disciplines like psychology, sociology, cinematography, photography, essentially everything outside of architecture. And I would look into TED Talks, all these different like videos, Jubilee, everything. I was
Yeah.
interested in everything. And so with my interest in, for example, with my interest in psychology and sociology, I was curious about what went on inside a person's head, how they ended up interacting with one another, how understanding, their social backgrounds, their culture, their heritage, everything like that could develop to who they become as a person that they are today. And the main takeaway that I got from that, from all that, and to intersecting it into architecture, was that the culmination of understanding of people and all those different things in psychology and sociology essentially helped me design for people using that building. Because with different cultures, they have different activities, different things that make them human, will make them be part of those people. And so designing for those cultures is super important. Like for me, when you go
Mhm.
so in America versus Filipino culture, Filipino culture, we're very family oriented. And so when we go, have you gone to Jollibee, Ryan? Do you know what
No, but I
Jollibee is?
keep hearing about it. Am I wrong in thinking it's oh, for whatever reason I always thought it was this kind of like KFC whatever thing. But isn't it just like a general fast food chain,
Yeah,
or what is it?
it's a fast food chain, but um, it's kind of like KFC, like very fast food thing where we sell spaghetti, pinakbit,
Spaghetti.
yeah, spaghetti, yeah, spaghetti.
Huh.
Um, we have burger steak, um, chicken, fried
Hmm.
chicken, all those different things. But in America, where the culture is very individualistic, right? Where
Yeah.
we have very smaller family gatherings. With
A
Filipino culture, it's
household,
much
yeah, it's
bigger,
usually not a big family household. It's
right? And
usually
so,
just the working parents with the kids,
right,
and then they
and
might
so,
visit grandma and grandpa's house or something on the
yeah.
weekends.
If you ever go to a Jollibee, Ryan, when you go inside, and at least in America, when you go inside, take note of how many people are waiting for the tables, because what they design, the designers there, they're not looking at Filipino culture. They're looking at
Mm.
American culture. You can tell the amount of seatings that they give is not for like Filipino culture. Like when we
Mm.
go to Jollibee, it's like 10 plus people. So we need a big table. But when you go inside the Jollibee in America, they have like those like dating booths where there's one person on one side and on the other. And like, it's not built for bigger families like Filipino culture. And so
Hmm.
that's one thing that I learned was that you have to really understand the culture, the people, their activities, the way that they interact with each other. Um, but another point I saw was cinematography and photography. How can I intersect that in architecture and
There
overlaps?
are a lot of parallels with that too.
Yeah,
It's kind of
um,
funny how every architect kind of becomes this photographer or whatever
yeah,
as a part of their
yeah.
portfolios, that extra section. Everyone has their little photography parts and
Dude, I tried to be one of those with my iPhone. I was just like, none of this is telling my story. But essentially, the thing that I understood was that in cinematography and photography, there's always a specific reason as to why they chose that shot in order to
Mm,
tell their own story. So in my head, the main takeaway that I got this from this and integrating into architecture was that every shot that I choose for my presentation has to always tell a story. Doesn't matter what, doesn't what it is. It has to always go back to the theme. Always has to go back to the idea. And so that's one of the things that I learned from looking into that type of field.
well, that's kind of interesting. This that idea. I mean, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but this idea of translating other interests outside of architecture studio and bringing them back in and translating those lessons,
Mm-hmm,
those ways of looking at that hobby and bringing them back to architecture and in your
mm-hmm,
studio projects. Like I'm sure that influenced your renders quite a bit, how you staged
mm-hmm.
them up before you started photography and after you started
Yeah,
photography.
yeah,
And the way you do those hero shots for your portfolio is definitely a lot different than what you used to do in first year. So
dude. Yeah.
it's really cool. If I encourage you guys to do this too. If you look back at some of your old projects and compare them to it is after third year, probably is when I think most people change a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be interesting to see how much different of a thing it is. It's like, oh, I used to do that. Where's the rule of thirds?
It's pretty bad because I remember my concept for my first year project was what's it, two datums or something. I was like, what the? And I looked
Hmm.
back to it as like, was this? I looked at the drawing, the hero shot. I was like, yeah, my this dude did not do what he said. But you know, you live and you learn.
No, I think one more thing about that too, exploring the outside and bringing it back to architecture. I really
Mm-hmm.
think movies bring a lot of foreseen parallels from cinematography into architecture. There's a
Mm.
lot of ways that composition and color, storytelling, lighting, all those
Yeah.
things that you don't really think about too much when you're watching the movie, which is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you want to follow the story, not necessarily what's on screen. Well,
Mm-hmm.
how it's set up.
Yeah.
But when you bring those the arrangement of things, the way that the composition is on screen,
Mm-hmm.
the way that they tell the story from shifts in light, there's a lot of moments like that in really good movies where
Mm-hmm.
they show a transition of a character's mindset.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously it's happening in their head, but the way they shift the lighting from one color to another, but it's
Mm-hmm.
the sunset or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
like it
Yeah.
goes from a warm light all the way to like pitch black or something. You're like,
Yeah.
ooh, that's
Yeah.
that's kind of cool. And then when you
Yeah.
think about that in terms of, okay, how do I put that into architecture? Because that's a really cool idea. You could
Mhm.
do something similar to how the sun angle or whatever, once you walk down the hallway, that sun angle no longer gets, or the
Mhm.
sun angle doesn't spread as far once you go
Yeah.
further into the hallway. So you
Yeah.
transition from that sunset to the pitch black dark or
Yeah.
whatever. Like in the, what did we, it was in Professor Hot Dog's
Yeah.
class.
Yeah.
What was it? The sauna building or the bathhouse?
Right. The Amangiri bathhouse or
Yeah, the
whatever.
Amagiri bathhouse. A lot of it was trying to play with lights from
Mhm.
above because we're inside a cave or inside a cliffside. So you have to really play with this light and the storytelling ability and everything too.
Yeah.
So
That also reminds me with, well, for example, with the movie thing, is the Parasite. You've seen this, Ryan. I think you've seen all these
yep.
videos about architecture. So basically the behind theme is that is capitalism, like the next level of capitalism, really. How the poor and the rich, there's the rich versus the poor type of theme right there that's going on, and how they set that up through their whole story is so intriguing because the rich are put up on the hill where there's like no one else around them except them. They have a really beautiful yard. There's a really nice lighting. And then the poor people, the family that we saw, who would be the parasite to the rich people, I guess, were living in the basement. And so the setup for how every single thing for cinematography always went back to the theme of the movie. And so that was just, you know when a movie is good is when they always go back to the theme.
Symbolism and all that.
Yeah, it's so good.
Yeah, I think that transitions us well into the next part. Something Albert and I were talking about is we really think that design studio was only, or design studio acts well as a starting point. I think the real challenge was integrating what we specifically loved into our projects. I think that was a very big motivator behind why we get behind this message of self-teaching and improving your skills and trying to find other avenues to stand out. And for I can start, I think for me,
Mm-hmm.
I've ironically, as an architecture grad and everything, I have a lot of engineering qualities in my brain where I'm trying to constantly think of ways to improve certain
Mm-hmm.
things rather than necessarily come up with things from scratch or thinking more.
It's like you see something and you're like, oh, this is so good. What if I can do it better? Like,
Yeah,
there's an improvement factor to the thing that you want to
yeah,
do.
for sure. So a lot of that even carries into, well, how I design projects for one. I'm always looking at typologies and trying to think of ways to build upon those typologies or ways to change it or
Mm-hmm.
ways to reinvent what it could mean.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of how Big does their projects too, like combining a waste management plant into some ski resort type of thing. Like who thinks of that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
But they do, they combine what doesn't feel like it should combine and they improve upon certain typologies and reimagine what it could be. And I
Mm-hmm.
really draw to that. So
Mm-hmm.
I bring a lot of that into my studio projects. And even with thinking more reflectively on my studio projects in my portfolios, looking back on renderings that I used to do and being step back and wondering how can I improve upon that. And
Mm-hmm.
usually how I go about things of trying to figure out like what I love about projects is specifically with the renderings. I really like thinking about ways to represent an idea well in just an image. Very similar to photography, but I don't quite have the same high quality camera that Albert has and all this other stuff. So the passion is just a passion or a hobby thing, not
Yeah.
much of a
No.
a really deep set thing for me. But pages like Show It Better on YouTube, he has a lot
Mm-hmm.
of great ones about how to improve your render styles. Just little minor things that add a lot to your images. For example, there's no image that you take in the real world is perfect. There's always like some leaves scattered on the ground. There's always some type of crack in the concrete or whatever. When you're polishing things from Enscape, all the textures are perfect, all the lighting is perfect, all the building materials are perfect. But when you build those things in real life, they're not. You have
Mm-hmm.
to think more about the photorealism approach and how can you add those tiny little details that just make things so much better. So
Mm-hmm.
combining that whole engineering side of my brain is like, how do we improve upon this and find
Yeah.
those extra details from YouTube videos? And I have a whole playlist that I just save these things to and
Yeah.
always refer back. It's just a lot of fun to take those extra parts of like what I love
Right.
about design and improving the ways of how you represent that and just bring it back to studio.
So Ryan, do you when you have a problem, you go search for the problem, or you watch videos and you're like, oh, that's so interesting. You put that into your
Hmm.
like back pocket, I guess. Or what's your like what is that like for you?
I think a little bit of both. I YouTube is my Netflix. I know a lot of people spend their time like watching Netflix stuff, but
You
mine's
know,
YouTube.
YouTube and chill.
So yeah. So when I'm going through like sitting in studio on the weekends trying to get the project done, I'll have YouTube pulled up in the other tab. Some people have the Office pulled up on the other screen, but whatever. And I I'll always have these videos playing on the side, and always there's things that the YouTube algorithm recommends, and usually
Mhm,
they're pretty related to some type of architecture content if that's what I'm looking to. And I
mhm,
see a lot of these videos pop up about like what I was just talking about. That one by Show It Better. It's like how to improve your render styles, or
mhm,
5 tips for improving your renderings or something. So then I'll either add that to a save and watch later because I'm like, oh, I want to do that at some point. I don't have the
mhm,
time right now, so let me save that and come back to it when I have the time.
mhm.
Otherwise, there'll be other things where I'm soaking it in while I'm working on other stuff. I do that with podcasts a lot, but just hearing things, passively learning about things too, is something that I
Mhm,
really keep in my brain for problems for later.
mhm,
Otherwise, to answer your question for the other side, why it's kind of both. There will be
mhm,
moments where I definitely am trying to set up a portfolio or something for like the design expo. And the
mhm.
problem is I need a better layout for my portfolio. I will go to YouTube and just search that and watch those videos. There might be a few more saved on the side that I'll like add to my playlist to watch later, but I'm
Right.
definitely actively searching for them at that point.
Right. I think you and I have very similar like passive learning, I guess, and that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the way that I would describe my own self teaching would be like number one, I would have to find an interest in something, which is what you do essentially.
Yep.
You find something interesting and then you save it for your playlist, I guess. But with mine, growing up, I was always interested in detective stuff. So like I grew up watching Sherlock, Detective Conan. I don't know if you know that it's an anime, but if people who are anime lovers out there who know Detective Conan,
If you know, you
you
know.
yeah, if you know, you know, you got it. But growing up, that's what I loved, and so I figured out like the mystery behind the certain things was super intriguing, and so eventually got really deep into understanding people, hence psychology, sociology, and all those different things. So the second part of my self teaching journey is consuming as much content as possible within that subject itself. So if I'm interested in psychology, sociology, I go to TED Talks, watch all those different things. I look at different like cultures, the presentations for their cultures, and all those different things. And essentially, I got to really understand how the brain worked, how their social and cultural backgrounds informed who they are as a person they are today. Third part is then trying to relate what I just consumed into design and architecture. So let's say after
Mm.
consuming a lot of content about Filipino culture, I find out family and family gatherings are a huge part of what they value. I would then relate that into architecture as bigger space, bigger tables, distinction of spaces between different generations, etc. The fourth point and the last point would be to apply that into the design from the concept phase all the way to the detail phase. So an iteration that I would probably do looking at the Filipino culture and Filipino family value is probably being able to turn the idea of a wall into a door. Basically, what I don't know if we can talk about this, but Olsen Kundig does this really well, where they turn a wall into a door. Um,
Yeah.
basic, it's the idea that a wall being opened and closed down could make a space big for a family gathering or small for an intimate space. And
Mm.
imagine a wall that swings out into the backyard and something that connects to the living room
Mm.
from the outside seamlessly. That way you're still able to have the intimate setting for smaller family gatherings when it's closed down versus the livelier setting when there's a bigger gathering when the wall is opened up. So basically that's what it is.
Interesting. Yeah.
So that's my 4 steps into everything that I really like. But to really drive this point, here is an example of what I would do. Let's say I was interested in a musical play because that's why I grew up loving. So I love like Phantom of the Opera, Les Mis, all those different things. I would consume as much musical theater content as possible. I would then start to wonder how does musical theater keep the focus of the audience to the performers on the play? And then I would start looking into
Mm.
architectural elements around the idea of performing. And so turns out spotlights are how they kept the focus on the performers. And so then I would try to integrate it into my project. So the project that I'm currently working on is trying to figure out how to make people interact and give focus to an object in space. I would then start implementing the ideas that I learned from performance into architecture. So then I would look into how light can aid in my goal to make people interact with an object, similar to how the spotlights aid in the focus of the performers. I would
Mm.
look into designing for skylights, diffused lighting, all these reveals, etc. That type of thing. That's how my brain works when I'm trying to self-teach something.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe while we're on that too, what should students do? Like, how should we be going about this thing of self-teaching, trying to build ourselves up and stand out from things? And
Mm-hmm.
I think you really hit on a good topic, which is just find something that you're genuinely interested in and just focus on it. I think
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of bad rap about the way that the architecture student culture is in general. It has a lot of toxic aspects to it that I'm not such a
Mm-hmm.
fan of. One of them in particular is it seems like it's almost bad to like architecture for some reason. It seems like there's always this negative hints of negativity in the fact that, oh, I'm an architecture student, but then people feel a little guilty or ashamed about it for some reason. At least
Mm-hmm.
the people that we seem to grow around and everything. It always
Mm-hmm.
felt weird to say, oh yeah, I'm spending Saturday in studio. It's not ideal, but also it's something like you should be enjoying what you're doing. If you're,
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm not explaining it the best way, but
No,
if
because
it's something that you're genuinely interested in, you're spending money to be here, you're doing your tuition for architecture school. Why
yeah.
would you not be taking it seriously and like have a genuine appreciation for it, a genuine interest in it? I'm not saying it
Yeah.
has to take over your entire life, but I'm saying you should feel like focus on, you should have a passion and feel prideful about
Mm-hmm.
being in an architecture space. Like, you know how many people think being an architect is cool? Like, why don't, for some reason, I feel like our generation specifically has this disconnect where all of a sudden it's, oh, architecture takes over my life because I'm always in the studio all the time. Yeah, it really does suck. And it's not the greatest thing. And I hope that it can change in the future. But also, use that to your advantage. If you're going to be spending
Mm-hmm.
all these hours in studio anyways, double down on it. Like, really figure out how can you become the best architecture student
Mm-hmm.
that can then get you, once you're off the treadmill of architecture studio, how can you use all those skills and help
Mm-hmm.
benefit you once you graduate, once you're going out
Mm-hmm.
to the field? And that's when all these higher end firms and all these things, they're looking for those people who double down. They're not looking for the people who kind of sort of did these things. They're looking for people who spent 40 hours alone rendering stuff in the weekends or whatever. That's an exaggeration, but you get what I'm saying. It's not the half-assed people that make it into
Yeah.
these big firms. It's the
Yeah.
ones that double down.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
Like,
people need to realize that too. Again, it's your choice. You can do what you want to do. If architecture is just kind of a side thing and you're just looking for a job to do it,
mm-hmm.
that's cool. But also, I really do think you need to take this seriously if you want to take it seriously after
Yeah.
graduation.
And that's something that I tend to do with myself as well. Is like I'm interested in a lot of things, but specifically, my camera just died, I think.
Yep.
But
I'll put your sticker up in the edit.
okay. But essentially, the what I do is I'm interested in a lot of things outside of architecture, and so I try to bring those all in back to architecture because architecture is something that I love. And so I'm never bored with doing anything that's not architecture because I try to bring in things outside of architecture into architecture.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point, actually. Yeah.
Oh, a second thing is that competitions really help you drive. It really force yourself to learn skills and to self teach because
Mm-hmm.
you're not graded anymore. It's all for fun at this point, unless you're
Mm-hmm.
trying to get the money. But dude, join competitions because competitions help you to learn these skills that you want to do or want to learn. Like if you're
Yeah, again,
interested,
it ultimately just comes down to how passionate are you about architecture and design. Again, if you really are trying to build upon your skills, like Albert's saying, competitions are a great way to force yourself to learn those, but then do it with a couple friends while you're at it too. So it feels a little bit less of some like extra homework or something if you want to think about it that way. But it can also become something that helps you really learn for the next semester or whatever, especially if a competition's coming up, like the Manko or maybe even the Bowman or something, how to step up your renders to the next level. How now that you're in a competition, you're not doing it for studio, you get to spend a little bit extra time to learn Grasshopper and bring those skills back with you to the next semester or
Right.
whatever it will be, right? You can even do this
Mm-hmm.
while you're at your full-time job when you graduate or anything too. So
Mm-hmm.
it's truly boundless. You can do this as often as you want to, and you can learn a lot more when you take it a lot more seriously and apply
Right.
yourself.
Right. And I think that goes along with joining competitions is that you have to have develop like a growth mindset instead of a fixed mindset. And
Hmm.
I guess to make, do you know what the fixed mindset and growth mindset are, Ryan? I think we
I
talked
mean,
about
another
this. Like,
growth mindset, the fixed mindset, I'm not so certain about what that is.
yeah, the fixed mindset is basically people tend to think that their, the core abilities and qualities, like their smarts, their talents, are set in stone. Instead of growing and improving these specific qualities like smarts and talents, they're focused on proving them instead. Instead of improving them, they are proving them instead. I don't know if that made sense, but they think that success comes solely from being naturally talented rather than
Mm.
being putting in any effort into that said skill. So, for example, this would be a statement from a fixed mindset would be, if I don't try new or hard things, then I won't fail. Or here's another one: I'm either good at something or I'm not. Or here's
Mm.
another one: I'm just not good at math. Everyone's probably said this at some
Interesting.
point.
Mm.
And so in the growth mindset, there people believe that they can boost these core abilities by putting in the grind and staying dedicated to those specific things. Just like what you were saying with the competitions, Ryan. Having brains and talent is just the starting point. This mindset sparks your passions for learning and toughness that is important to achieving bigger things. So an
So
example
yeah,
would
what would be
be
like an example of a growth mindset then?
Yeah, so an example would be I have to try new and difficult things in order to grow, even if I fall at first. Another thing is
Hmm.
I can improve my skills with effort and practice. I'm not good at this yet, but I can improve with
I think that's
effort and
the big
practice.
key of that. I'm not good at it yet, but let me learn this a little bit, and
Yeah.
then I might not be
Yeah.
the greatest, but I'll definitely be better than nothing.
Yeah. Math is challenging for me, but I can improve.
Mm.
That's the biggest part is that there is a qualifying of yet, but because these are things that are not set in stone, but if you put time and effort into them, you can improve.
So let's talk about some of our takeaways. Again, if we're referencing the beginning, we were talking about how you can learn new skills outside of architecture and just build upon architecture skills. So that way you can be the top of your studio, you can get your dream firm job, or you can do all these other things, right? But I think the biggest thing for me that I genuinely think is the most important part to make sure that you can get that is to find things that really resonate with you outside of architecture and being able to
Mhm.
bring those into architecture, but also just doubling down on the fact that you do like design and architecture. Again, I think so many people are shy about the fact that they're in architecture and design, or they see it as somehow like it's this thing that shouldn't be taken as seriously, or they see it as something to be like shameful about or hide it from other people, or the whole thing was like, oh, I can't do it because I'm doing this in studio on Saturday. Like those moments, again, they really do suck, but it comes down to, do you want it bad enough? Like, do you want to become the top person in this thing? Because if you
Mhm.
do, you have to double down, you have to dedicate
Mhm.
yourself to learning these different types of skills, so that way when you graduate, bigger picture again, you stand out from everyone else that's applying for that same position. If you're the
Mhm.
person that took the time to learn Grasshopper and others didn't, if you're the person that took time to learn how to prompt Midjourney to get really cool renderings, but others didn't, if you're the type of person that was able to figure out how to lay out your portfolio the best, but others didn't, who
Mhm.
do you think is going to get the job? You can answer that for yourself.
Yeah. My camera's on. Oh my god.
He looks different now.
But no, I think I agree with you, Ryan. You have to kind of double down on if you love architecture, you shouldn't be ashamed of it, like you're doing architecture. That's something that you want to do. But I think my specific takeaway is that just be interested in things. Because when you're interested in things, the more you want to learn from them, and the more you learn from them, the more that you can apply them to the things that you are doing. So if you're interested in movies, dude, go at it, King. Go for it.
Yeah.
Go for it. And then eventually the things that you learn from movies is going to translate into architecture or the things that you want to do. So no matter what, you're going to be learning something.
Yeah.
That's my biggest takeaway.
Well, thank you guys for listening to this episode of the Curtain Podcast. Hopefully, by listening to this episode, you now have a bit more passion in what you're doing in Architecture Studio, and you can really start to apply yourself to learning more things. And I'm hoping now that you actually understand a little bit more about like why it's so important to learn these things in studio, and just really help you stand out from everyone else in the architecture industry and become like a much better designer because of it too.
Anyway, before you leave, if you like this episode, check out some of the other episodes like Design Differently and 5 Things We Learned in 5 Years. Also, if you have anything you want us to talk about, DM us your questions and topics on Instagram.
So we'll see you guys in the next episode, and don't forget to save.
Don't forget to save.